I never expected my neighbor to invite me in, especially with her sister quietly waiting just behind her. The first time I really noticed her, she was tending to her small garden in the late afternoon sun. The golden light caught the soft highlights in her hair, and there was a quiet grace in the way she moved, bending to touch a flower or adjust a plant. I stopped on the sidewalk, pretending to tie my shoe, though every part of me wanted to watch her just a moment longer. She didn't notice, or perhaps she did, but didn't care, which somehow made her seem even more real, more alive. Her presence wasn't loud or demanding. It was subtle, like the warmth of sunlight spilling across your hands when you hold a cup of tea. I could feel it even from a distance. Then I noticed the sister, standing slightly behind, leaning against the doorway with her arms crossed loosely, her gaze calm but curious. She didn't approach, didn't speak, she simply observed. There was something quietly powerful in that, the way she seemed to measure the world and yet remain apart from it. When she finally looked up and noticed me, I felt a brief flicker of self-consciousness. Her eyes were clear, steady, and there was a softness there, the kind that made a stranger feel, against reason, like they might belong just a little. A gentle smile curved her lips, and suddenly the mundane act of walking past someone's house felt charged, like stepping into a private moment I wasn't supposed to see, but somehow was invited into anyway. "I didn't expect to see you out here," she said, her voice warm, low, and easy, carrying just enough amusement to make me stumble over my words. I managed a half-smile, nodding, and for a heartbeat, we simply looked at each other. Her hand brushed against a flower as she spoke, a tiny movement, but it lingered in my mind far longer than it should have. Behind her, the sister shifted slightly, the soft rustle of her clothing almost inaudible but enough to remind me she was there. I caught the corner of her mouth twitch into the hint of a smile before she settled back into quiet observation. It was strange, noticing someone so fully without them ever approaching or speaking. There was a tension there, subtle and layered, like the air before a gentle rain. Then came the invitation, casual but deliberate. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" The words were soft, but the pause before them suggested thoughtfulness. My heart jumped, not for fear, but because of the weight behind the simplicity. The sister's eyes followed every movement, still quiet, still assessing. I hesitated, feeling a pull I couldn't explain, as though stepping over the threshold would change something irreversibly, but in the best possible way. Her presence was immediate when she gestured toward the door. The way her fingers brushed mine, light and fleeting, sent a shiver through my arm. It wasn't bold or demanding, just intimate enough to make me aware of the physical closeness, of the human connection quietly unfolding in front of me. And behind her, the sister remained, a quiet shadow of curiosity and grace, waiting to see how this new thread of interaction would weave itself. By the time I stepped closer, my mind was a mixture of hesitation and intrigue. Something told me this visit, however brief, would linger far longer than the afternoon light, like a memory pressed gently into the corners of thought, soft and unavoidable. The invitation hung in the air longer than the words themselves, almost as if the pause had weight. She didn't rush me or push, only smiled with that quiet confidence that made it difficult to say no. "Come in," she said again, softer this time, almost like she was offering a secret. I glanced toward the sister, who had shifted just slightly, the faint crease of her brow betraying curiosity, or maybe cautious approval. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, but her stillness made me more aware of every movement, every small choice I was making. Stepping forward felt oddly momentous. The threshold of her door seemed to stretch out, both literal and symbolic. The warmth from inside seeped out, carrying hints of brewed tea and soft cotton, comforting yet intimate. I caught the scent of her perfume again, a subtle mix of vanilla and something green, like freshly cut leaves, wrapping around me for just a heartbeat. My fingers brushed the doorframe as I crossed the threshold, and the smooth, cool wood felt grounding, as if it were anchoring me to this moment, this unexpected invitation. She moved slightly to let me pass, and our hands met in a light, accidental brush. Nothing overt, just enough to leave a lingering warmth, a flutter of awareness that made my pulse catch. The contact was fleeting, yet it made me realize how attuned I was to her presence. Behind her, the sister's gaze followed every step, quiet but precise, like a calm observer measuring the dynamics between us. There was no judgment, only a gentle, unspoken acknowledgement that she was there, silently witnessing the interaction. The living room was softly lit, a lamp casting a golden pool of light that seemed to settle comfortably around the furniture and us. The faint hum of a ceiling fan mixed with the distant sounds of the street outside, creating a private world where time slowed just a little. She gestured toward the sofa, a fluid movement that seemed to invite not only physical closeness but also emotional openness. I hesitated, aware of the sister in the corner, whose stillness amplified my own self-consciousness. Every step toward the sofa felt measured, deliberate. The neighbor's presence radiated calm assurance, as if she understood my uncertainty and offered reassurance without words. When she reached out to guide me, her fingers lightly touched my hand, just the barest trace of pressure, enough to steady me without commanding it. It was intimate in a way that made me pause, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was profoundly human, warm, tactile, real. The sister remained quiet, leaning slightly against the doorway, observing with an air of quiet curiosity. There was something grounding about her silence, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this interaction, that the dynamics were layered and complex. I felt the subtle tension of being a guest in this intimate space, yet it wasn't uncomfortable. It was electric, in a gentle, almost imperceptible way. As I settled onto the sofa, the neighbor sat a comfortable distance away, angled slightly toward me, her presence enveloping the space like soft sunlight. Every gesture, every slight movement, the tilt of her head, the lift of an eyebrow, the faint brush of her sleeve against my arm, felt deliberate yet natural, drawing me further into the slow rhythm of connection. And behind her, the sister's quiet vigilance lingered like a steady heartbeat, a reminder that this encounter was more than casual. It carried weight, expectation, and a subtle promise of unfolding intimacy. Once I was seated, the room felt both intimate and slightly charged, like the air before a gentle summer storm. The neighbor settled across from me, angled just enough that our knees almost brushed when she shifted. The sofa cushions cradled me, soft and familiar under my weight, while the faint scent of her perfume lingered, warm and inviting. I couldn't help but notice the way her hair fell over one shoulder, catching the soft light of the lamp, every strand seeming to move with a quiet grace. The sister remained slightly behind, near the doorway, but her posture had softened. She leaned against the frame with her arms loosely crossed, the small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips suggesting she was intrigued, not critical. Every so often, her gaze flit toward me, then back to the neighbor, silent yet full of observation. Her quiet presence made me more conscious of my own movements, my own words, as if we were three threads weaving slowly toward a shared understanding. The conversation began casually, the kind of small talk that could have been mundane, but with them, it carried weight. The neighbor asked about my day, my work, the books I'd been reading. Her questions were gentle, but the tone was warm, inviting me to linger in the answers. She leaned in slightly, a tilt of her head, eyes locking on mine just long enough to make me feel seen. Every so often, her fingers brushed the edge of a teacup, the subtle motion drawing my attention without distraction. I realized that the sister, though quiet, added a unique rhythm to the conversation. Her laughter, soft and restrained, would punctuate a point I made, a sound that was brief but lingering, like the echo of a bell. I caught myself smiling more than I expected, feeling a strange mixture of comfort and anticipation, my awareness split between both women. It wasn't just attraction, it was the emotional resonance in their attentiveness, the warmth that seemed to fill the room. At one point, the neighbor tilted her head back slightly, brushing a lock of hair from her face, and a small, teasing question slipped from her lips. I stumbled over my answer, and for a moment, our eyes met and held. There was something unspoken in that pause, a shared acknowledgement that words weren't always necessary. The sister's soft smile and quiet observance only amplified that feeling, like a third presence silently approving, challenging, or simply noting the subtle tension in the air. The tactile details of the room kept me grounded yet aware. The softness of the cushions, the warmth of the mug I held, the gentle hum of the fan overhead, it all contributed to the intimacy of the moment. When I laughed, the neighbor's hand brushed lightly against mine in response to a story, a fleeting contact that made my chest tighten slightly. It was not bold or deliberate, yet the warmth of it lingered far longer than the actual touch. By the time our small talk had settled into a comfortable rhythm, I realized how natural their presence felt, both the neighbor and her sister. There was no rush, no overt push, only a quiet intimacy growing through shared stories, glances, and the soft music of their voices. Every pause, every subtle gesture, was layered with meaning, a silent dance of observation and connection that made the ordinary feel extraordinary. After the initial small talk settled, a different energy began to fill the room. It was quieter now, not empty, but charged with something softer, more intimate, an unspoken permission to be seen, not just observed. The neighbor leaned back slightly on the sofa, the soft curve of her shoulders relaxed, as if inviting me to notice the person behind the polite smile. The sister, still near the doorway but now more at ease, had uncrossed her arms and was leaning casually against the frame, her gaze warm yet attentive, like someone carefully listening to a story that mattered. It started with a simple admission. I mentioned something small about my own insecurities, about work, about feeling like I didn't always fit in, and found to my surprise that my words didn't feel heavy. The neighbor's eyes softened, and she gave a small nod, a gesture that was comforting in its simplicity. "I understand," she said, almost as if acknowledging not just my words but the hesitation behind them. Her voice was low, steady, carrying warmth that made it feel safe to continue. The sister's reaction was quieter, subtler. She shifted, tilting her head, and a tiny smile played at the corners of her mouth. There was no need for her to say anything. The way she watched me, her presence gentle but attentive, spoke volumes. It was a reminder that vulnerability didn't have to be lonely. It could be shared quietly, without fanfare or pressure. As I spoke more, describing fleeting moments of self-doubt, I noticed the tactile sensations around me. My fingers curled around the warm mug of tea in my hands, the smooth porcelain grounding me. The neighbor leaned slightly closer, her hand brushing the edge of mine when she reached for her cup, a contact so fleeting it could have been accidental, yet it lingered, leaving a warmth that seeped deeper than the surface. Her proximity made the space between us feel soft, inviting, like a gentle current pulling me in without force. Then there was the sister, who finally stepped closer to observe a small detail of the living room, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The motion was delicate, almost unconscious, and yet it made me acutely aware of her presence. She wasn't intruding, she was participating silently, offering reassurance with nothing more than her steady gaze and subtle movements. It struck me how two women, so different in approach, could create a shared atmosphere of trust that felt both intimate and safe. At one point, the neighbor's voice dropped even softer, sharing a personal story of her own hesitation and mistakes when she was younger. Her words were careful, honest, and there was a faint catch in her throat that made the moment feel fragile, precious. I realized I was leaning slightly forward, drawn in not by attraction alone but by the quiet humanity of the connection. The sister, still nearby, offered a gentle smile, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this shared space of trust. By the end of the conversation, the tension that had lingered in the air transformed into warmth. A lightness replaced the initial uncertainty, a sense that this moment, small, quiet, unremarkable in the outside world, was profound in its own right. Shared vulnerability had become the bridge connecting the three of us, binding us with subtle gestures, fleeting touches, and honest words. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. But it was real, and in that reality, something quietly powerful had begun to bloom. After the shared vulnerabilities had settled into quiet understanding, the energy in the room shifted again, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't something spoken, it was in the pauses between words, the way glances lingered a fraction longer than necessary, the subtle brush of a hand against mine when passing a cup of tea. Every movement, however small, carried weight, and I became painfully aware of it. The neighbor leaned slightly closer while arranging a few books on the table, her shoulder brushing mine almost by accident. Or maybe not. The contact was fleeting, just enough to make me notice the warmth radiating from her, the faint scent of her perfume brushing against my senses. My pulse quickened subtly, though I reminded myself to stay calm. After all, it was only a brush of shoulders, yet it carried an unspoken intimacy that words could never capture. The sister, meanwhile, had stepped a little closer than before, ostensibly to pick up a cushion that had slipped to the floor. Her fingers grazed mine briefly as she handed it over, and I felt a ripple of awareness that spread from my fingertips to my chest. There was no deliberate flirtation, nothing overt, but the contact was charged in the most human, understated way. Her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and I could feel the quiet curiosity in that glance, a mirror to the subtle tension building in the room. Every casual movement became a shared rhythm. When the neighbor leaned back in her chair, the way she crossed her legs brought her closer to me physically without breaking any boundary. When she reached for her cup, the tip of her fingers brushed my hand, and I was struck by the warmth lingering even after contact had ended. The sister, silent and observant, leaned in slightly to comment on something I had said, and for the briefest moment, her shoulder touched mine. These small interactions, so easily missed in another context, became monumental, a slow dance of proximity, awareness, and emotional electricity. I noticed more than just the physical contact. There was a softness in their voices that made my chest tighten in anticipation, a careful attentiveness in their expressions that made silence feel meaningful. Laughter, when it came, wasn't just amusement, it carried a gentle intimacy, a quiet acknowledgement of a connection that didn't need words. Even a pause, the moment I looked up and met one of their gazes, felt deliberate, as if the air itself had thickened with potential. I realized that the room was not just a physical space anymore. It had transformed into a shared emotional territory. Each glance, each touch, each hesitant lean was a thread connecting the three of us in a pattern I was only beginning to understand. The neighbor's hand resting near mine, the sister's subtle proximity, the softness in their smiles, it all spoke to something deeper, something unspoken yet undeniable. By the time the conversation drifted to lighter topics, the unspoken chemistry had settled into an almost tangible presence. I was aware of their warmth, their attentiveness, and the delicate tension that seemed to pulse quietly in the space between us. It wasn't urgent, it wasn't desperate, it was patient, observant, waiting to be acknowledged, to be nurtured, and to grow naturally. And in that quiet, electric moment, I felt that something extraordinary was beginning, without a single word needing to spell it out. By the time the evening had settled into a comfortable rhythm, I felt a shift within myself, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't in what was said, but in what was simply present, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm circles of light, the neighbor's gentle attentiveness, the sister's quiet observance. Their presence wasn't overwhelming, it was grounding, enveloping me in a way that made the room feel smaller, yet fuller, as if the three of us were the only people in the world at that moment. I realized, slowly, that I was acutely aware of every detail, the neighbor's hand lingering near mine on the armrest, the way her fingers moved unconsciously as she spoke, the warmth radiating from her presence. The sister's subtle movements caught my attention too, the faint tilt of her head, the soft brushing of her hair from her face, the way her eyes seemed to quietly measure the world, yet not judge. Their energy was different, complementary, one warm and inviting, the other calm and observant. Together, they created a balance that drew me in, made me feel seen, and quietly made my heart swell. It happened in a series of small, almost imperceptible moments. The neighbor laughed at something I said, her shoulders relaxing as she leaned slightly closer, and I caught the warmth of her presence, the faint brush of her arm as it passed mine. It was fleeting, yet it resonated like a quiet chord, tugging at an awareness I had tried to suppress. The sister, meanwhile, shifted to adjust her seat, and her proximity, just close enough to notice the subtle scent of her perfume, the softness of her voice, made the air feel charged without words. I caught myself watching them, noticing how natural they were in the space, how effortless the connection seemed to flow between all three of us. There was no need for grand gestures. The intimacy was quiet, unfolding in shared glances, brief touches, and the comfortable silence that spoke louder than any conversation could. I realized I had been holding my breath without knowing it, aware of how deeply drawn I was to both of them, and how simultaneously easy and terrifying it felt to be so close. The neighbor's gaze met mine for a moment longer than usual, soft, unassuming, but filled with an almost imperceptible warmth that made my chest tighten. Then, almost instinctively, the sister offered a small, approving smile, a subtle acknowledgement that the quiet connection between us was real, valid, and shared. It wasn't about claiming or demanding, it was about recognition. For the first time, I understood that the feelings I was experiencing weren't one-sided. There was a mutual, unspoken affection, a bond forming gently yet undeniably. As I sat there, surrounded by their warmth, I became conscious of the simple joys, the softness of the sofa beneath me, the gentle hum of the fan above, the faint scent of tea lingering in the air. Every sound, every touch, every glance seemed magnified, meaningful. And in that quiet realization, I understood that this connection, delicate, patient, and alive, was something rare. Something worth savoring. Something that had begun to root itself in the gentle spaces between words, glances, and touches. By the time the conversation drifted toward lighter topics, I felt it clearly: the emotional intimacy, the unspoken desire, and the quiet trust had all converged. I wasn't just aware of my own feelings anymore. I was aware that we were all connected, delicately, profoundly, in ways that didn't need to be named to be felt. And in that realization, I felt something that was both thrilling and comforting, a certainty that this slow, careful bond would continue to grow, naturally, beautifully, and without force. By the time the evening had fully settled, the tension that had simmered so quietly throughout the visit had softened into something warm, steady, and profoundly comforting. The initial hesitation, the small but deliberate touches, and the unspoken glances had all transformed into a shared rhythm, subtle yet undeniable. The room felt like its own small world, a cocoon where the three of us existed together, fully present, fully attuned. We had drifted into a quiet lull after laughter and conversation, the kind where words are no longer necessary because the presence of each other carries meaning enough. The neighbor leaned slightly forward, adjusting a throw pillow, and our hands brushed in passing, not deliberately, yet the contact lingered, like the faint echo of a song that stays in your mind long after it has ended. I noticed the warmth of her skin, the softness of her sleeve, the gentle curve of her smile, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade into the background. The sister, sitting now a little closer than before, tilted her head as she listened, her quiet attentiveness drawing me in. When she laughed softly at an aside I had made, her voice was like a gentle melody, light yet grounding, reminding me that connection didn't always need grand gestures. It could exist in small, authentic moments. Her hand brushed briefly against the edge of my chair as she shifted, and the sensation was grounding, a tactile reassurance that the bond forming here was mutual, subtle, and real. We shared stories, some light and humorous, others tinged with reflection. Every glance between the three of us carried weight, a silent acknowledgement of the trust, respect, and quiet desire that had grown without force. When I looked at the neighbor, I noticed the softness in her eyes, a warmth that wasn't about obligation but choice. And when I looked at her sister, there was the same subtle invitation to be present, a gentle reminder that intimacy can be quiet, patient, and steady. There were small gestures, too, that spoke volumes. A hand resting lightly on my arm as she laughed at something I said, a shoulder brushing mine as the sister reached for her cup, the warmth of the tea mingling with the warmth of proximity. Each touch, brief and careful, reinforced the quiet, steady bond that had been building throughout the evening. There was no urgency, no pressure, just the gentle unfolding of connection, one layer at a time. As the night drew on, I realized how completely at ease I felt. The initial nervousness had melted away, replaced with a calm certainty. This connection, delicate and patient, was mutual and deep. We weren't bound by convention, expectation, or haste. We were bound by awareness, by attention, by the simple but profound act of being fully present with one another. In the final moments, the three of us shared a soft laugh over something trivial, our shoulders almost touching, our hands brushing lightly as we adjusted our positions on the sofa. The neighbor's eyes met mine, warm and steady, and the sister's quiet smile followed, a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding. The room smelled faintly of tea and evening air, the light from the lamp soft on our skin, the silence comfortable, the warmth real. It was a perfect, gentle conclusion, not dramatic, not rushed, but full of the subtle intimacy that had been building since the first brush of hands, the first shared glance, the first moment of mutual vulnerability. We were together, fully, naturally, and the slow, patient rhythm of connection felt as enduring as it was beautiful.